My name is Bruce Deerenfield, and I teach African American history at Canisius College and direct the All-College Honors Program. I'm glad you're here for what should be an illuminating talk on a timely topic. As Americans, we're taught that what happens to us in this life is the direct result of our actions and our talents. That's true for some, but for many other Americans, it's not true. Race continues to be a major obstacle in achieving the American dream. The story is familiar, but must be recounted briefly at moments like these. The United States was founded in large part on the backs of imported West Africans who served as slaves, and these forced laborers made tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton planters the richest people in the land. Emancipation brought a glimpse of a better life for the former slaves, but this glimpse morphed into a nightmare of Jim Crow laws, convict leasing, and lynching for anything an angry or jealous white accuser claimed had happened. As law professor Michelle Alexander shows in her acclaimed book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, American society recalibrated its racism after the slave period ended formally, and indeed after every period of social change, including the modern civil rights era. All too often to be black in America meant to be confined, quote unquote, in one way or another. Ultimately, confinement meant large-scale imprisonment for minorities, especially African Americans who used drugs. Whites were as likely to use hard drugs as blacks, but blacks went to prison far more often in the so-called war on drugs of the last half century. And under the aegis of the carceral state, slavery has been sanctioned by the U.S. Constitution, despite the 13th Amendment. Once convicted of a felony, black men were, and are, subjected to all forms of discrimination, including employment, social services, housing, voting, and jury service. In fact, I heard on the television the other day that voter suppression for this election has amounted to 1 million black votes. 1 million votes all told. Such controls continue in place despite the facts that illicit drug use has not increased, violent crime has declined, and the prison system has utterly failed. In one way, the carceral state still serves a societal function. It preserves a racial caste system. Our speaker tonight is Professor Dan Berger, an associate professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington, the Bothell campus. He earned his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania and has written or edited several books in his young career. His book, Captive Nation, Black Prison Organizing in the Civil Rights Era, won the James A. Raleigh Prize from the Organization of American Historians for the best book dealing with race relations in the U.S. Tonight's lecture has been arranged by the OEH's Distinguished Lectureship Series and is co-sponsored by the Canisius All-College Honors Program, the Immersion Eastside Program. We have two members of that group with us, leaders of that group with us tonight, the History Department, and the Department of Sociology, Criminal Justice, and Environmental Studies. And I thank my colleagues for their support. The title of Dr. Berger's talk tonight is Freedom as Method, Slavery, Prisons, and the Modern Carceral State. Please welcome Professor Berger to Canisius.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Professor Deerenfield, for that wonderful introduction, for inviting me. Thank you to all who co-sponsored this event, who helped organize this event, including Joan Wadsworth. I don't know if she's here, but wonderful solver of logistical problems and preventer of logistical problems. And thank you all for coming. As I was finishing this talk, I changed the subtitle some, as you see, from Slavery, Prison, and the Modern Carceral State to be Slavery, Prison, and the Black Freedom Struggle, because I think what I'm really interested in is freedom, and what I hope we all are really interested in is freedom. And I think in these dark and dispiriting days, it's always good to remind ourselves about freedom and to illuminate freedom. But I also think in order to do that, we have to identify what it is we mean when we talk about freedom, because perhaps there's no word that is more widely used and yet differently used in the American lexicon than freedom. So when I say freedom, I do not mean the ability to set up a checking account without any overdraft fees. I do not mean the awesomest vacation rental that you can find, the best diet that you can be on, the coolest sunglasses, and I certainly don't mean whatever that is offered to advertise. When I talk about freedom, I want to talk about the kind of freedom that was imagined and conjured, and in particular the kind of freedom that was practiced by the rebels aboard the Amistad slave ship. I want to talk about the kind of freedom that Paul Robeson and Lorraine Hansberry had in mind when they edited a newspaper of that name in the early 1950s. The kind of freedom that is too often forgotten about in the famous 1963 March on Washington, but for whom I would say freedom is much more of a kind of structuring focus of that event than Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, for which it is more widely remembered. And I want to talk about the kind of freedom that is evident in the program and the platform of the Black Panther Party, among other examples. But of course, to talk about freedom in that way, right, is to talk about unfreedom. And part of the problem that this country has in approaching freedom and understanding freedom is that, as historians Edmund Morgan and numerous others have diagnosed, that freedom is always right, produced through and in relation to unfreedom. And Professor Derenfeld mentioned two of the sort of main structuring forms of American unfreedom that I want to talk about, right? Which is obviously starting with slavery, right? And going to move sort of quickly through the problem at some level, right? But just to sort of show the expansion of right, the slave system, from 1790 to 1850, sort of, approaching the Civil War, right, where we can see the kind of deepening of these sort of sectional divides, but also the carceral state, right, and we can lots of ways to sort of approach the problem of mass incarceration. Actually, don't have a lot of slides about the kind of grim facts and figures and statistics. I'm sure they're familiar to many of you, right? The 2.2 million people who are incarcerated, the 2.7 million children who have an incarcerated parent, the 6 million people who can't vote because of a felony conviction, and so on, right? We can talk more about the kind of grim realities of how the sort of carceral state continues to sort of structure unfreedom, right? But we see a sort of dramatic rise in incarceration, right? Both in the mid-20th century and then particularly in the last 3 decades of the 20th century and the first decade and a half of the 21st century, right? This chart, right, sort of tells us a certain kind of growth narrative, but when we talk about mass incarceration, I think we also need to follow its sort of spatial logic, right, similar to slavery, that we can see, right, sort of move throughout the country and grow throughout the country, right? So too that we can see prisons, right, sort of dot the carceral landscape, right, or the American landscape becoming a carceral landscape. And if you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to check out the artist Paul Rucker has a great 10-minute video on you can see on YouTube called Proliferation. And you just see the kind of expansion of prisons, right, from the early days of the country, and you just see a few kind of dots show up on this map, and then as time goes on, the dots just proliferate and proliferate and proliferate, right, until you get a carceral map that looks like this, right, where you can actually sort of trace the outlines of the country through its prisons, through its jails, and through its detention centers. Right? And I want us to sort of keep in mind, we can return to it in our discussion after, that when we talk about mass incarceration and when we talk about the carceral state, right, it might seem like we're talking about one thing, right, but really we're talking about a convergence of institutions. Right? And even the kind of figures that those of us sort of trade in, or those of us who study these issues trade in, right? Like I already threw out the 2.2 million people who are incarcerated. Even that actually makes it seem like a more kind of uniform thing, right? That all those 2.2 million people are sort of passing through or live within the same institution, right? But that 2.2 million people who are incarcerated that's a count of a given day, right? On any given day in the US, there are 2.2 million people in prison or jails. But actually, if you break it down, right, prisons are where people go for long stretches of time, right? Typically more than a year. And jails are where people go for shorter periods of time, even if they go there repeatedly. Right? So when you break it down that level, we have about 1.5 million people who are in prison for these, some for a year, some for 5 years, some for 100 years. Right? But jails see 10 million people pass through them every year. 10 million people in and out of jail, in and out of jail. So even right, the figure that's used to sort of shock us into the scale of this thing doesn't quite convey the true largesse of the scale, right? So I want to sort of think through, right, not only the existence of the carceral state of mass incarceration, but what mass incarceration has to do with slavery, right? And what is our recent and ongoing history of a carceral state relate to our history of slavery? And I think it's an important conversation for a number of reasons, right? Because it reminds us, right? It calls our attention very immediately to the fact that the U.S. has a relatively brief experience with not being a slave society. Right? So we have 300 years of slavery. We have depending on when you want to date it, either since 1865, society without slavery, since 1965 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, a society without slavery, or in some cases, we still lack that, right? We still have yet to enter a kind of post-slavery system, right? But even if you want to pick the most generous date and say 1865, right? The U.S. still has far less experience with any kind of freedom, right, and any kind of free society than it does in slavery, which I think explains a lot about where we are today. Explains more about today than I have time for, right? But I'm going to take this narrow slice around prison. When I say this, right, I want to just remind us that this is not just a conversation that academics have, right? It's not just a conversation of kind of historical importance. So this is a conversation that is active and ongoing. So we just finished the conclusion of a national prison strike, which is the second national prison strike in 3 years that has been organized by people who are incarcerated and that has seen strike activities in prisons around the country, and that builds off of nearly a decade of labor strikes and hunger strikes and other kinds of protests inside American prisons, jails, and detention centers. And what you'll see, what I've highlighted, this is the whole list of demands from the most recent strike, which I highly encourage you to read. I know the type is not such that you could read it on this slide, but you can find it easily online. But what I highlighted, right, and the demand that got the most attention in national media coverage was that second demand, an immediate end to prison slavery. And this was often taken to mean, right, that prisoners are working for free for private enterprise en masse, and maybe that's why we have mass incarceration. And people pointed to the 13th Amendment as evidence. Right? The 13th Amendment, for those of you who don't have it memorized, was the amendment passed at the end of the Civil War that outlawed slavery and wrote it into the Constitution at the same time. Right? It outlawed it in its first clause, and it wrote it into the Constitution with that subordinate clause, right? Except as punishment for a crime. And so the fact that the very amendment that seemed to eradicate slavery also allowed for slavery has rightly caused a great deal of attention and focus, but I think it's also caused a great deal of confusion about the relationship between slavery and mass incarceration, right? So what I want to suggest to us this evening, for us this evening, and why I think it's so important to talk about freedom, is that the 13th Amendment does not explain mass incarceration. Right? That the US has gone through different iterations of mass incarceration, right? And we saw some sort of peaks and valleys in the chart that I posted earlier. And that the most recent wave of the last half century is remarkably different than the era of mass incarceration that was evident at the end of slavery, right, with the convict leasing and chain gang system. And it's precisely on this question of labor that I think those differences are most evident. Right? So certainly after the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, and particularly after the dismantling of Reconstruction, right, which is, to my mind, as a scholar of the 20th century, Reconstruction I think is the most significant and fascinating and still determinative moment in American history. Right? And so you have things like, this is a drawing from Tennessee, but you have the convict lease system that absolutely sent, hundreds of people, thousands of people to prison for, minor offenses, for made-up offenses, what really underwrote a sort of vast architecture of white supremacy, specifically for the purposes of industrializing the war-torn South, right? Often putting in power or leaving in power the same people who were at the helm of the Confederacy, but also creating the possibility for the rise of a new elite on largely similar form of coerced labor. And yet, right, the 13th Amendment was not simply the result of conniving slaveholders who managed to figure out a way to maintain their slavery by another name, as a book about the convict lease system puts it. In fact, right, the reason why we have that exception within the 13th Amendment, right, that idea that, or the policy really, that slavery for punishment of a crime is legal, is because that was a customary understanding of how at least elites throughout the country understood labor and incarceration at the time period. So this idea of coerced labor for people who have been convicted of a crime could be found not only in places like Tennessee or South Carolina or other sites of the Confederacy, but could be found here in New York. Right? And in fact, one of New York's gifts to the history of incarceration in this country is exactly this notion of a labor discipline form of incarceration, right? As opposed to sort of Pennsylvania's model, which was pure isolation. Right? The kind of first prisons in Philadelphia, kind of pure isolation with the idea that would fosters people's sense of penitence, right? Hence the name penitentiaries, and instead it fostered people's sense of mental illness, right? Because when you isolate someone entirely, it turns out not to be a good practice for rehabilitation. And so instead you have this idea, right, of coerced labor and a kind of punitive mindset that holds that the state has, an obligation or a duty, or at least the right to visit extreme violence upon someone who has been convicted of a crime. So we have that in New York well before the Civil War. We have that in Ohio well before the Civil War. In the 1850s, right, as debates about whether to admit new states as slave or free foretold the coming of the Civil War, several of the free states had prison slavery. the first prison in California in San Quentin was built by prisoners, right, who were forced to build their own form of incarceration. Not their own design, right, but forced to build it. In Washington, where I live, when Washington was still a territory, before it became a state, it had a prison, right? That prison was built because of massive reports of and scandals around the convict lease system, and reports of abuse no different than what was happening in the South. Right? So prison slavery was an understanding, right, that people incarcerated, people convicted of a crime, could be treated as harshly, could be treated as disposable as anything under slavery. Right? And this was a sort of national understanding. This was a national approach to crime and punishment. And this also starts to key us in, I think, to some of the differences between slavery and the kind of modern carceral state. And I think some of those differences are rather grim, right? In ways that make I think the modern carceral state, I hope, right, convey how grim the modern carceral state is. So I want to do that by thinking through, right, two of perhaps the most well-known forms of or well-known sort of avatars of rebellion, right? One under slavery, and we'll compare it to one of the I would argue one of the most significant rebellions and figures of rebellion in the era of mass incarceration. So first, anyone recognize this painting? So this is a painting of Nat Turner, right, whose rebellion in Virginia in 1831 terrified slave owners, right, throughout the South. Partly it terrified them because of of how massive it was, right? Turner and his rebels killed, whole families of slave owners. Right? So people were sort of shocked by that, but also because that kind of sort of dramatic, bloody uprising was something that slave owners always knew was possible and always tried to project as impossible. Right? So next to the Haitian Revolution, Nat Turner's rebellion, was the most to sort of amplify, right, the Confederacy's drive to greater power and to greater abuse. Right. The next example, anyone recognize this figure? This is George Jackson, and George Jackson went to prison in 1960 when he was 18 years old, and he had gotten in trouble with the law before for a variety of petty things, fights, petty robberies, things like that. And then in 1960, he and a friend took $70 from a gas station. They robbed a gas station, but really just took it out of the register and ran. And because he had gotten in trouble with the law before, the judge sentenced him to serve between 1 year and life in prison. Right? And that kind of massive scale, right, that kind of sentence distribution was very common at the time, right, called indeterminate sentencing. And George Jackson became, very politically active in prison. He was very studious, talking to people, right, challenging the segregation of prison, right? Because even after the sort of formal vestiges of Jim Crow are rendered illegal, prisons remain segregated. And segregation is a kind of structuring feature of incarceration, right? In the same kind of Jim Crow way, right? Today, white people are watching movies, so black people can't go into that space, right? This side of the yard is for white people, that side's for black people, and so on, right? So he was challenging these kinds of policies inside. He was holding study groups. He was holding sort of physical education classes, right, where he learned karate in prison, and he taught other people karate, how to defend themselves from attacks by racist prisoners and by racist guards. And in August of 1971, 140 years after Turner's rebellion, George Jackson staged a rebellion of his own inside this sort of isolation unit at San Quentin called the Adjustment Center. And when I wrote a book that in which Jackson features prominently, when I set out to write that book, I thought I was going to be the one to crack the case and figure out exactly what happened in the Adjustment Center on August 21st, 1971, because it remains a mystery. Right? The government alleges that after a legal visit, George Jackson was secreted a gun that he tucked inside of an afro wig that he put over his head and walked about 200 yards, escorted by 2 guards without anyone noticing, and then took off the wig, took a gun out of the wig, put bullets in the gun, and then held the guards hostage. This seems rather incredible, rather unbelievable in a literal sense. And yet the fact remains that by the early afternoon of August 21st, George Jackson and 3 others were killed. 5 others were killed, and in a bloody, in a very bloody, very shocking uprising. Right? This was supposed to be the most secure aspect of the prison, and yet one of the most famous prisoners in the world, because by this point George Jackson had been a best-selling author with a book of prison letters called Soledad Brother, was dead, right? Had participated in killing several other people, and it seemed to, and there was a gun inside prison, right? Which prisons are not, even guards are not supposed to have a gun inside prison, precisely to avoid events like this, right? Okay, so why bring this up, right? On the one hand, we have these 2 sort of specters of violent rebellion, right? Centuries apart. But what I think they each get us to is the different value, the different economic value that enslaved people had relative to incarcerated people. When Nat Turner was killed, and even though he killed his owner's estate was paid $375 because, and I'm getting this from Dana Ramey Berry's brilliant book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, because Turner's owners had a life insurance policy on Turner. Right? They had an insurance policy on their property. Many slaveholders did, right? Particularly large slaveholders. And so there was value, right? There was economic value to Turner's life, right? Such that because Turner was executed for leading this rebellion, his owner's family received money, right, for the loss of their property. Right? It was how that was the transaction that happened. No such thing happened for George Jackson. Right? No one received any money after George Jackson was killed. Right? Not his family, not the state. In fact, obviously, the state was the one who had incarcerated him. Right? And I would, argue in a lot of ways, right? So Turner is the kind of, figure, right? Kind of the figure through which to understand particular set of tensions in the 19th century. And George Jackson is absolutely that figure to understand mass incarceration and understand the rise of mass incarceration. Because rather than see the start of mass incarceration as being a kind of post-1980 war on drugs, right? I think we have to see, and I think a lot of the scholarship on it in recent years has been in this vein, right? You have to recognize mass incarceration started much earlier, right? And then in fact, the war on drugs is a byproduct, right? Is a consequence of mass incarceration as well as a contributor to it, right? It's not the originator of mass incarceration. And really, it sort of begins in the war on crime, launched by Lyndon Johnson in 1965, as well as various patterns of policing in response to the Great Migration. We can talk more about this in the Q&A. But what's so fascinating and what I think is so critical, right, is that beginning in the 1960s and throughout the 1960s, even though the incarceration rate is basically stable, right? So overall, there's around the same number of people going to prison. The demographics of incarceration change. So prisons become filled with a lot more black people, right? And depending on geography, they become filled with a lot more Latinx people as well, and a lot fewer white people. And so this right, I would argue, is the kind of dawn of mass incarceration. And that prisons start to give up even on the idea of rehabilitation, right? And they sort of implement various forms of excessive punishment, right, on top of what had already been, very punitive environment. And that the war on crime, the war on drugs, and later sort of domestic wars on gangs, on guns, on terror, accelerate all of those things, right? But those dynamics, those processes are already in place, right, by the 1960s. And George Jackson, I think, is a figure of that. This is the kind of erasure of a black industrial urban workforce, right? Whereas Nat Turner, right, the slave owner had life insurance policy on his so-called property, right? By 1960, when you have George Jackson getting arrested, you already have sort of massive deindustrialization that's seeing chronic underemployment and unemployment among a sort of black urban working class. And because of other sort of large scale sort of economic shifts that we have now come to call neoliberalism, right? You have a large black workforce that has been rendered largely obsolete under capitalist conditions. And so there's no life insurance on them, right? There's no investment in their labor. Their labor has been rendered unnecessary, right, through automation and other forms of globalization. And so instead what we have is mass incarceration, right? That's a lot of information. I wish I had I should have made a handy slide, right, so tease out some of those dynamics, right? We can talk more about those details. But that's the big difference, right, that I think we need to keep in mind. That slavery is at core, it's not only this, but it is at core a means of extracting profit through forced labor. Mass incarceration, right, at least in sort of modern mass incarceration since the 1960s, is at core a way of repressing workers who have been rendered obsolete by global capitalism and who are in rebellion, who are up in arms, who are marching for jobs and freedom, and who are demanding freedom through organizations like the Black Panther Party and others. Right? So that kind of economic shift, right, creates a pretty wide gulf, I would say, between slavery and prison. And yet the sort of bodily violations that daily life of being enslaved is, I think, bears some remarkable similarities to the daily life of being in prison. Excuse me. So I want to review a couple of what I see as some of these kind of core similarities, and then turn towards what this all means for a sense of freedom and why I want to think about freedom as a method. And I think the key point, right, is this idea of captivity or confinement. So we can think about, right, I'm sure sort of images like this are very familiar to you, of slave ships, right, that sort of transported people from Western Africa across the Atlantic Ocean, right, all throughout the Americas. And you see, right, through each of these bodies, right, sort of stacked like cordwood, stacked like silverware on top of each other, right? And people denied any privacy, denied any dignity, shackled in the hold of a slave ship, right? We can see similar, by no means the same, right? Similar dynamics in prison, right? In the very fact of human caging, right? And in particular through things like solitary confinement, right? So this is a picture of the adjustment center unit at San Quentin, right? Where people were in their cells 24 hours a day, denied human contact, but under at least the threat of constant surveillance and certainly constant abuse, often denied reading material, denied bedding in many cases. So we have read the very form of constraint, right? Next we have the coffle, right, through which enslaved people were forcibly moved within the domestic United States, shackled to each other. And there are many possible images, right, through which we can see the same thing happening in jails and prisons around the country, right? Including about half of the states in the country allow the shackling of pregnant women during childbirth. New York, I don't believe, is one of them anymore. But again, we have, right, the same kind of, or at least not the same, but very similar forms of constraint that characterize the experience, right, of being incarcerated. So let's think then about freedom, right? Because it's that, I think, on the one hand, we have this kind of negative of similarity, right? Similar forms of captivity that I think join slavery and prison. And then I also think we have a similar kind of definition of and approach to this idea of freedom, right? Of how do people understand freedom, and I think, in fact, how do people practice freedom in this time period, right? So a number of scholars of slavery have talked about, right, something that we might think of as kind of collective care, right? As the communion found in song, in dance, in pleasure, in support for each other, whether biological or fictive kin networks that enslaved people form in order to survive their experience, right? This, I think, is in fact a sort of cornerstone of what at the time was sort of new slavery studies beginning in the 60s, and certainly has been enlivened and studied in much greater detail more recently, right? I also think we find a lot of collective care in prison, and of course this is a harder thing to find representations of because of the various restrictions on media access in prison. And there are many kinds of examples that we could talk about, but one that I just want to highlight here is the work around HIV and AIDS in prison. I think this is one of the most significant civil rights campaigns and health rights campaigns to happen in recent years that has not yet gotten the full attention that it deserves. But throughout the 80s and 90s, the kind of institutional first neglect and then reluctance that governed the government's response to the AIDS crisis generally was exacerbated tenfold in prison, right? Where people who showed any signs of the disease were quarantined, were treated with full hazmat suits, were subject to all manner of epithets, and where a sort of conscious neglect not only cost people's lives who could have been prolonged or maybe even saved, but also created a lot of fear and distrust within prisons, among prisoners, right? And yet people organized against that, right? And New York, I think, has a particularly strong role in that process, right? In that history. So a former member of the Black Panther Party and a political prisoner named Kwesi Balagoon died of HIV-related illnesses in 1986, sparking a number of other of his comrades in prison to start doing work around HIV and AIDS. So they started peer education programs to try and teach people about sort of fact from fiction, right? Because the level of kind of institutional abuse and neglect was so severe. The greatest success of this was the PACE program at the women's prison at Bedford Hills, where the warden ultimately was very supportive, and they ended up writing a book together. But it also existed without the men's prisons as well. There's Pause magazine has a very important article on it that you can find online. But this work saved countless numbers of lives, right? Simply by teaching people what HIV and AIDS were and what they weren't, how the disease was spread and how it wasn't, and teaching them basic skills to keep them safe. This is a sort of dramatic, right, example of a kind of collective care that people had to make out of no way, right? Whether that was ultimately granted some kind of institutional support or not, right? This is a form of kind of collective care that incarcerated people practiced, right? Print culture. So the kinds of newspapers and magazines and books that not only allowed formerly enslaved people to sort of share their experience, but also that became such a kind of fulcrum of abolitionist activity, right? By providing a direct understanding of what slavery was and why it was, and the ways in which it was so horrendous and so abusive, right? And this was, particularly important given the formal prohibitions against literacy for enslaved people, right? And we see a very similar thing with incarcerated people as well, right? These examples are all from the 60s and 70s, so that's the time period I studied, but we could, follow that kind of print culture through to the contemporary period, although the internet makes things very complicated, but better and worse in ways that we can talk about, right? But here's, you see Soledad Brother, the book by George Jackson that I mentioned, and after the success of that and a number of the other books that are on here, Jessica Mitford, who is a progressive journalist and author in her own right, joked that literary agents were scouring prisons for talent, right? And because these books made such a sort of profound impact in translating the prison experience to a larger audience, right? And in starting to sort of break the stigma that incarceration held. And again, right, in an environment where the prohibitions on literacy are not the same as slavery, but where there are very severe prohibitions on accessing written material, on people being able to write their own stories, right? One of, I think, the kind of victories of the prisoner rights movement was precisely to sort of try to crack open that door for incarcerated people to tell their stories, right? And then the last one that I want to talk about is this idea of bodily autonomy, right? And there's lots of ways that we could think about this, right? Certainly things like, the Underground Railroad and actually, escaping slavery constitute the most significant expression of bodily autonomy, but also the rarest, right? Escaping was incredibly difficult, and yet, right, enslaved people found ways to preserve, to protect, to enhance where possible their bodily autonomy. My brilliant and dearly missed colleague Stephanie Camp, in her book Closer to Freedom, talks about the dances that enslaved women would organize, right? And the sort of attention to dressing nice and having fun, right? How much sort of work went into having fun in that sense, and how that in and of itself was a kind of practice of freedom, right? So I think when we're thinking about these kind of forms of captivity and confinement, the notion of freedom is absolutely political, but it also, but also exceeds the political, precisely because the violations on the body, the violations on people's ability to relate to one another as social beings, the way that humans are, is itself, right, under assault, right, is itself kind of prevented. And so, again, lots of examples that we could think about for prison, but I'll focus on this one because I really love this picture, and I wanted it to be the cover of my book, but I lost that fight. But it's on the inside. So these are three men who were part of a case called the San Quentin Six. I mentioned, George Jackson was killed. There were 6 men who were charged with participating in the uprising that happened that day. Here are 3 of them, and the case was the longest and the most expensive case in California history up until that point. Very, very significant case, in part because it was also multiple cases, because they sued the state for the abuses of solitary confinement and a set of physical abuses that happened inside a prison, and won some very important civil rights. And so during their case, the judge and jury took a tour of the prison. And the men were being, so you see David Johnson in the back, Hugo Pennell kind of squatting, and Fleta Drumgo kneeling. And they were kind of being marched through the prison. And then there was a tour, and they were being kind of pointed at and sort of made into a spectacle. while surrounded by so many guards. And so in protests, they simply sat down. And you see, what I love about this picture, right, is you see there's, at least twice as many guards as there are the three of them. And they're all shackled, you can't totally tell perhaps, right, but they're shackled at their wrist to their waist to their ankles, and their waist to the waist of the gentleman behind them. And so they can't go anywhere and do anything, and they're still totally outnumbered. And yet, right, we see this sort of dramatic expression of control over their own bodies, right? Whereas in this moment, right, through this peaceful, nonviolent action, they're able to express, right, some access of control over their lives in an institution that has sort of fundamentally denied it. Okay? And I think this is a signal example of the kind of freedom that we're talking about, right? And why I want to talk about freedom as a method. Because when we think about freedom as a method, right, as I said a minute ago, it includes political freedom, right? It includes an end to the barriers that prevent people from participating politically, right? Whether that's disenfranchisement, whether that's policing, whether that's incarceration itself, whether that's a host of other issues, right? But it also includes something more basic, more fundamental, more human, right? And it's the convergence of those two that I think is the freedom in Black freedom struggle, right, or in the Black freedom movement. And so that brings us to Trayvon Martin. In a lot of ways, right, it could bring us to a number of people who were killed well before their time. But I think it particularly brings us to Trayvon Martin because the 17-year-old Florida native who was shot and killed by George Zimmerman in 2013 was walking home from a convenience store, right? When a kind of self-appointed vigilante stopped him, provoked a fight with him, and ended up killing him. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, right? It was Martin's killing, as well in particular as the failure of Florida courts to initially to prosecute George Zimmerman and then to secure conviction of George Zimmerman that launched the Black Lives Matter movement. Right? And the Black Lives Matter movement has sparked a number of very critical documents, and I would particularly encourage you to read the Black Futures document, the Movement for Black Lives platform. Sorry, I'm saying two things. To read the Movement for Black Lives platform, as well as the Fund Black Futures document, which was produced by a Chicago group sort of affiliated with Black Lives Matter called the BYP 100. Both of these documents are profound, right? There's a very profound strategic thinking. There's a very profound sense of a kind of political and economic world that we live in, as well as the kind of political economic world that we want to live in, right? And all of that began with the attempt by a 17-year-old to walk home from a convenience store unmolested. And I think that, right, is what connects the attempt, right, to sort of survive slavery with the various attempts to survive mass incarceration, right? A kind of a notion of freedom and an approach to freedom as something that must be, an approach to freedom as something that cannot be bought or sold or consumed or scared into existence, right? But rather freedom as something that must be chosen, right? Something that must be cultivated, something that must be practiced, right? And in that sense, freedom is a method. Thank you very much. So I have been told this class lasts for 2.5 hours, which I think means we have plenty of time for questions. But yeah, Bruce, maybe you'll cut me off when we're done. But please, questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
What are the types of businesses that are benefiting from prison labor?
Yeah. So the question was, what are the types of businesses that are benefiting from prison labor? You know, those of us who study the issue of mass incarceration well, I'll put it more personally. My partner often teases me that the thing that's going to drive me over the edge is that people talking about private prisons all the time, because most of the prison system is government run. And so most of the way that money moves through the prison system, right, including the kind of exploitative ways that you're asking about, are not through private companies that prisoners work for. Because most people in prison don't work, right? Most people in prison structurally don't do a lot of anything, right? As people, they do a lot. They read, they communicate, they correspond, right? They do a lot. But structurally, in terms of what's allowed, what's provided for them, they don't do very much. Even where there is some kind of work available, right? It's work that is for the prison itself, not for private companies. So people might work in the yard, they might work in the kitchen, they might work as a teacher's assistant in a program, right? The kinds of things that sustain the prison in some way, but that there's no profit that's being extracted anywhere, right? So this is, again, is that kind of economic difference that I was talking about earlier. Now, where does money move to the prison system, right, is somewhat of a different question, a really great question. So one of the sort of prime areas of, I think, the kind of, exploitation, right, and the kind of the ways that companies are sort of profiting off of the poor who are incarcerated is through the high cost of phone calls, the high cost of emails for states that have that allow prisoners to have email access, of the high cost of books, right? Currently in Pennsylvania, about a month ago, the state tried to shut down all books coming from prison book donation programs and otherwise, and so is trying to implement a rule that would require incarcerated people to buy a tablet for $155, and then to buy books from pre-approved vendors that would go, for that tablet alone. If prisoners do have jobs in prison, they make pennies on the dollar, right? In Pennsylvania, they make 19 cents an hour. Right? They make 19 cents an hour working for the state, right? Not for private companies. But all that to say, if you make 19 cents an hour, it's going to take you a long time to get $255 to buy a tablet. So I think those are the areas, right, where money is often moving through the prison system. I think, the private bail industry and bail bondsmen. But again, I think we have to be attentive to how money is sort of moving through it, and recognize that most of the ways that money moves through the prison system is still through the state. So some of the most key aspects, right, that people are exploited, that people are in lifetimes of debt over, is through legal financial obligations. So because of your conviction, you have to pay X amount of money in restitution, you have to pay X amount of money in legal fees, and these are debts that you cannot get out of through bankruptcy, and these are debts that accrue interest while you're incarcerated, right? Someone I know in Washington, I think he started off with like $3,100 of LFOs, but because the interest rate is so high, he's been in 20 years, and now he owes $3,200. The numbers are off, right? But he owes more than his debt is, right? That is a state imposed debt, right? Similarly with bail, right? Bail is something that the state imposes, right? And that's why you see a number of moves to sort of end cash bail, right? So, and then the biggest way that money moves through the prison system is through paying to keep facilities open, right? And that's all our money is. It's all tax money. Yeah, here and then here.
So is the implication for the George Jackson rebellion, is it possible that there wasn't a rebellion? Is that because we don't know what happened?
Yeah, something happened, right? I think the implication is that the government has said that George Jackson tried to escape on August 21st, and that he was killed and 5 other people were killed in the course of an escape attempt. I think the evidence offered for that is not sufficient. It's not persuasive. but something definitely happened, right? Maybe he was trying to escape at another time, and that's how he managed to get some weapons, or maybe he was a very despised figure among the guards because he was an international celebrity, right? He was an international celebrity because he was saying how racist and awful and abusive prisons are. And so they hated him, right? He not only was sort of calling them out to their faces, right, but he was beloved all over the world, getting mail from all over the world. So some theories have it that guards just tried to kill him and he overpowered them, that there was no escape attempt, there was no anything. I think the only thing that's clear is that he was not trying to escape on August 21st. Whether he was trying to escape and had a weapon, maybe, whether he was, set up and about to be killed, and he just overpowered them and killed people before he was ultimately killed, are sort of equally plausible and implausible to me, right? Yeah.
I have an advocate question.
Great.
Because we're in Western New York.
Yes.
So you have to get an advocate question.
Please.
And I'm thinking about Heather Thompson's Blood in the Water, which is the prize-winning book about Attica, and the role of the guards. And this is where I know you're not saying that slavery and mass incarceration are the same. You're unique and distinct in really important ways. But one of the things that Thompson and Attica's story really makes clear is that this largely working class, white, rural workforce, who in the case of Attica are killed by and wounded, not by the prisoners, but by the state, whether it's National Guard or military.
Right.
I mean, that's sort of a different case. And that's a different workforce, but it's part of the larger system. So I wonder whether you might say something about Attica or say something about the role of the guards in the system that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big question because it's an important issue, right? I think the guard force is not that much different in economic background than the incarcerated population, right? These are working class people, by and large, but it's a largely working class white rural population, which is different than a Black and Latinx urban working class population. I think one of the things that comes out of this time period of the 70s and the prison movement of the 70s is a much more organized guard force that materially improves their circumstances and so becomes sort of less working class, right, in terms of their financial resources. But then becomes, particularly in California and New York, and this is an area where Heather and I have some different inflections, but particularly in New York and California, become really leading avatars or leading proponents of a more punitive prison. Heather would say, I think Heather has said, and I'll put it that way, that those are exceptions and not the rule. I think it's more widespread than that. I think the guard, not individual guards, but the guard force as a political bloc, as a population around the country, views the prison movement in the 70s as a threat and views the reform efforts that were very half-heartedly implemented as part of the problem, and so organized against them, and I think very, very effectively. So in Washington, there was a fascinating example of prisoner shared governance at Walla Walla prison in the early 70s that the guards resisted and hated and undermined, and then after it was undermined, there was several chaotic years, and then Walla Walla became a much more brutal and intense isolation prison. It became the modern maximum security prison. And that was lobbied for by a sizable block of the guards, again, as a political unit, right? So I think I think that I think we have to be able to think about the guards as a block, rather than say it's not individual guards who are this, that, or the other, right? But the police officers and correction officers unions, I think across the country, certainly in different ways, were a very conservative force in arguing for bigger prisons, longer sentences, more forms of restraint, isolation, and control. I think there were some legitimate safety concerns. If you're going to cage 1,000 people and have a guard force of 100 people, certainly people are going to have concerns over their being outnumbered in that kind of environment. But I think the solution is that we need to have fewer people in prison. But the solution that the guards unions offered was more punishment. Yeah.
So we are deciding to force those who are oppressed to break down the systems that the oppressors build. So when you tell me that an 18-year-old faced a potential life sentence, I'm 21. That's real shocking to me. But I am related to people who you could tell that same thing to, and then further tell them that he then was killed in some mysterious situation. And I have family members that will say step by step that he deserved that life sentence for stealing $75 and that he potentially deserved to die for stealing those $75 at 18 years old. So with those types of people, I guess, to dismantle this modern slavery system, you have to foster, empathy. How do you talk to those people?
How do you talk to those people is perhaps the question of our day. I can't give you the answer, honestly. But I can say a couple of things. One is statistically, right, we know that most people who commit any kind of offense do so between the ages of about 17 to 26. So this idea that locking people up for life or for 5 life sentences or for 100 years or for 80 years or for 20 years is, as a deterrent, is not based on anything other than vengeance. Right? Scientifically, right, people commit offenses usually because they're young. Right? They're young and they're in a particular circumstance, whatever that circumstance might be. Right? But that's not a compelling answer. It's a true answer, right? It's 100% accurate. But that in and of itself is not enough. Right? I think, to my mind, it's one of the many things that the sort of Me Too movement has so powerfully revealed is how we have 2 separate justice systems in this country. If you are rich and you do the same thing someone across town does or someone the next town over does, what happens to you is totally different. It has nothing to do with the offense itself, right? So you can commit sexual assaults or sexual harassment, and you could go to prison for 30 years. You could do that very same thing and have a different last name and live in a different town, and you could be a senator or a Supreme Court justice or the president of the United States. So over and over and over, we have countless examples of, right, it's not what you did that matters, it's who you were when you did it, right? If you did it at all. But there's nothing, right? I mean, you see people, I mean, I'm watching that documentary series, How to Make a Murder, right? And, you see, I mean, I'm on season 2, right? I'm committed. And you see all the resources that goes into trying to prove Stephen Avery's innocence, right? What I love about that documentary is that everything from the blatantly coerced confessions, right, the strange evidence, all that stuff happens every day in so many parts of so many jurisdictions, right? I mean, there's some weird, unique stuff there, right? But the basic outline of that case happens every day. And I think you have this kind of white working class family that I think is a really fascinating avatar through which to imagine how unjust our normal justice processes are. And it takes millions and millions of dollars, right, to try and challenge that. Right? And even then, it might not be enough, right, in this particular case. So we have two different justice systems. It has nothing to do with the offense itself, right? It's who you were when that offense happened. And I think ultimately, Sister Helen Prejean talks about, and Brian Stevenson, a number of people talk about, that we are better than the worst things we've ever done. So you could talk to people and say, that they're talking about you when they say that, right? They're talking about your friends when they say that. Because that's honestly what it comes down to, right? Yeah. Okay. Here, let's come over here and yes, please.
I want to ask you to say a little bit more. I'm struck by your delineation between slavery and modern carceral state as they're not equivalent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you talked a little bit about the geography of the carceral state, and
Yes.
I'm wondering if one thinks about the prison or prisons as a geographic location that's going to extract a certain kind of wealth, the sort of industrial product at a time of deindustrialization becomes the management of bodies,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you're taking a mostly white labor force that would be pushed out through deindustrialization, and you're giving them the job of managing the bodies that you want to discard, right? And
Yeah.
so you kind of create, I think, a kind of production of profit in that manner and
Sure.
and a redistribution of wealth.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, is it all that different than slavery, differently inflected because it's a different economic moment, but you see that sort of buy-in with people who were slave catchers, who were overseers. It's a kind of parallel model.
Absolutely. I think the difference comes in the fact that the slave was valued as property, but valued, right? That there was economic value in the work that the enslaved people were doing, right? So that you would take out insurance policies on them. And so the only difference, right? Or not the only, but in terms of the of the kind of geographic sort of genealogy that you laid out, right? The difference is that the slave is always valued economically. The prisoner, even though, right? I think you're absolutely right, right? It's a shifting of resources, right? From that. It both is and is a product of the shifting of resources out of the cities, right, to rural areas. That comes as well with the shifting of political representation, right? So that the Prison Policy Initiative does some wonderful research on this, that of what they call prison gerrymandering, right? So that most people are counted when they're apportioning senators and representatives. Most people are counted where they are incarcerated, rather than where they're from, right? So then, right, you have this match, like just like the Electoral College, just like so many other things, right? You have this sort of massive, sort of double dipping, triple dipping, quadruple dipping of what is numerically a very small population. That dramatically inflates the economic resources available to them, as well as the political representation that they have to carry out that agenda. Right? So that's where I think, right, that's why I think the connections between slavery and prison are so important, right? Because it's absolutely the thinking and the structure of slavery that gives us mass incarceration in the modern carceral state. And yet the differences, right, the connections are so important that it's important that we get it right? and not see them as just the same exact thing. I think the fact that you have a large workforce, right, that is a rebellious workforce in terms of challenging the segregation of American housing and American jobs, that workforce is deemed unnecessary to society is really different than a workforce who is demeaned and abused and for whom people are wholly reliant on. So even though, right, the small town might say, we want this prison here because we think it's going to bring jobs, they're putting their faith in the prison, right? And the studies are rather mixed about whether they get any economic benefit from that, right? But there's nothing that then translates about the prisoner. The prisoner is expendable in ways that the slave had economic value. Please.
I'd say yes and no, because you rely on the body of that prisoner. That is a necessary component, and the people who are gaining value, like under slavery, are identified as white people. So,
Well, yes, although sociologist John Eason has done a book about sort of prison construction in Arkansas that was looking primarily at a rural black town, and so it's as patterns of housing and settlement change, even who's accruing any benefit from those jobs changes as well. And you have a number of Black and Latinx correction officers now as well. So yes, absolutely right. There is an argument about the prison is going to give us jobs, but I still think there's a different relationship about the relationship to the prisoner than to the slave. I think the prisoner, precisely because let me put it this way, for my own clarity, if not for anyone else's, that slavery underwrites the entire economic fabric of the modern world, right? The English commoner drinking tea with sugar is enjoying slavery, right? That's not the case with the 100 prison guards in that town, right? So which is to say that prisons don't underwrite the modern American economy, and certainly don't underwrite the global economy the way that slavery did. Right? So that argument, even if it shares lots of logics with slavery, right? It shares even a certain kind of economic incentive, right, to slavery, is writ on such a small scale, because you're talking about really the 100 people in that town and the towns around it. Whereas slavery is the economic foundation of the modern world. And I think that's a really profound difference. And the economic foundation of our modern world is much more reliant on disposability, right, and the disposability of labor than on the degradation of an enslaved workforce in that way. Right? We could keep going, but yeah, thank you. I think I saw a hand. Yeah, why don't you in the back and then you in the front, and then we'll move back this way. Yeah, please.
Do you believe with states like Colorado, among others, still technically having slavery in their constitutions in the way that the U.S. Constitution does, is causing slavery to be brought back into the light and giving a sort of justification to lifetime sentences / the rate of mass incarceration?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to this this sort of attempt on the ballot in Colorado to remove the kind of exception clause from the 13th Amendment as it exists in prison. I think that the momentum behind that, the drive for that, comes entirely from the kind of organizing that I referenced at the beginning of the prison strikes that have happened over the past several years. The kind of organizing, Colorado was witnessed some very, very intense organizing against the opening of the super maximum prison in Florence, Colorado, which is like Guantanamo before Guantanamo. Right? So opened in the late 90s. So I think it comes right from the fact that people have really been trying to organize against that for decades. Right? But I think what I hope, right, this kind of comparison between and this kind of genealogy between slavery and prison shows that we can't end prison slavery by amending the 13th Amendment. I think it would be great if what many take to be the foundational document of the country did not say that slavery was legal, right? But I think when you look at prisoner rights litigation, when you look at the kinds of justification that are being used, it's not the 13th Amendment, right? In fact, it's the 8th Amendment far more so. Right? The 8th Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Again, sounds lovely, right? And yet, what conservative judges have interpreted that as repeatedly in recent decades is that something needs to be cruel and unusual, right? So something could be one or the other and has been constitutionally upheld. Give an example. Beard v. Banks, Pennsylvania Supreme Court in 2006 said that it wasn't pleasant that the state was denying reading material to people in solitary confinement so that they couldn't have so much as a newspaper or a magazine, but it did not rise to the level of being cruel and unusual. Right? So I think, right, the 13th Amendment I think is symbolically very important, but it's not the driver of mass incarceration. And so I hope it passes. I don't think it's going to do a lot substantively, right? Because I think the connections between slavery and prison are so profound that we can't actually end prison slavery without ending the modern prison as we know it. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I think I want to move it in a different direction. One of the concepts of freedom is the idea of self-governance or ethics. And I teach at Bodily, and we have a education program at Albion Correctional Facility. And looking at the history of that, it was a reformatory. And I think it started after the Civil War, and there was a reframing of work in prison as vocational to kind of juxtapose that against this convict lease. And so the idea was that you would have indeterminate sentences. And that's another aspect. So what I was thinking about is that, isn't that hope of freedom the idea that maybe it's not forced labor in the sense that someone's going to be getting early release? And so I just wanted to have your thoughts about that as seeing work as part of the Christian ethic of working hard and vocational or training.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my conversations with people who are incarcerated, has included a desire for meaningful work in prison. Right? If people are going to be incarcerated, we should at least have the opportunity to do work that is meaningful, to do work that is compensated, and to do work that can help us get jobs after release, right? So I was talking with somebody. I'm a volunteer at a prison near my campus, which so I was at a study hall session recently and talking with a couple people about this. And this one person said that he used to make enough money from working in this refractory in prison to pay taxes, right? That meant that he was able to earn Social Security for when he's older. More immediately means that he was able to contribute money to his family, who otherwise he was not able to contribute in the same way, right, because of his incarceration. And that has been taken away, and right now, the wages he earns are 42 cents an hour, so doesn't earn enough to contribute anything, much less to pay taxes, contribute anything to his family, much less to pay taxes. And the jobs themselves are these sort of make work tasks. And so, I think having the opportunity for people to work is important, but that work needs to be meaningful. It needs to be compensated. It needs to be union eligible, and I believe all of those things, regardless of incarceration, right? I think the issues, so many of the issues of prison are the issues that we face in society as a whole, right? But they're much more concentrated and much more exaggerated in prison. Yeah. Yes.
I'd like you to talk a little bit more about freedom as a method. How would that work as a platform for developing some kind of strategy for allowing people to become free? I'd like you to talk more about that.
Sure. I think it is the strategy that is already being implemented, right? Because I think part of why I came to this topic, and I got quite obsessed with the idea of freedom, right? Because as someone who studies the Black freedom struggle, who feels very indebted to the Black freedom struggle for giving my, life meaning in so many ways, I was so frustrated to look all around me and see the kind of forms of freedom, or the invocations of freedom that I mentioned at the beginning, or I was sort of checking and so on. But also even to look at the scholarship and see freedom be only kind of interrogated as a kind of neoliberal subject, or freedom to only be sort of a category rather, and freedom to only be understood in these kinds of delimited, imperialistic, privatized sort of notions of freedom. And to see it kind of move away, right, from even retaining any value to the concept of freedom itself. And I felt like the history of the kind of organizing that I sort of gestured to this evening is far too transformative, and remains too transformative, to abandon to the neoliberals and the reactionaries. And so to my mind, I think the method of freedom, right, is exactly the kind of method that is being operationalized through the kind of grassroots campaigns, whether it's the prison strike, or whether it's groups like Release Aging People in Prison in New York, or Prisoners Are People Too here in Buffalo, a group I helped start in Pennsylvania called Decarcerate PA, Critical Resistance in California. I think the modern, not the modern, what's it called? The new Poor People's Movement, that Reverend Barber has been such a powerful and visionary force of. I think that all of these and a million others that we could talk about are examples, right, where freedom is being operationalized in the way that we're talking about, right? Which is to say, it's a kind of freedom that is practiced, right? It's a kind of freedom that values the things that make us human, and seeks to expand and preserve and protect the things that make us human. But it's a freedom that only exists, really, I think that can only exist in practice. Hence the method side of it, right? Because I think the invocation of freedom, right, that we need to invade Iraq to help free these poor oppressed women, or we need to I can't even, I don't even want to ventriloquize the current administration, right? Talks about freedom as this kind of, bullying, violent enterprise, right? I think those are kind of freedom as this kind of abstraction, right? That is used as a bludgeon against the actual things that make us free. So I think campaigns to make sure that incarcerated people have meaningful work and have access to read and write is a kind of freedom. And I think that freedom exists on a spectrum with the kinds of policies that will end life without parole sentencing, and that will make sure that people don't come into contact with the criminal justice system in the first place, right? I think there are these things that exist along the kind of spectrum. But that I think is the method side of it, right? That kind of recognition that freedom is something that we can inhabit, right? It's something that we can practice with each other, that we can refine, but it's also something that we can sort of study and expand, right? Because it does exist on this spectrum. And to me, I think that is right where I see the kind of long lessons of the Black freedom struggle as informing so many of these different kind of campaigns. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the school-to-prison pipeline and how that connects and what role that plays in this Black freedom struggle.
Yeah. So the school-to-prison pipeline. There's a scholar in California, I forget what school, Damien Sojourner, who talks about not as a pipeline, but as a convergence, right? Which is to say, what people are often naming with the pipeline, right, is the ways that people come in contact with the criminal justice system at a really young age, and that he's sort of tracing that to say that the systematic divestment of funds and resources and meaningful curriculum from impoverished school, typically schools that are predominantly people of color, actually moves the prison into the school, right? So it's not just the pipeline out of the school, but it's actually, right, so criminal justice in schools. So think about, for instance, how many of you went to a high school or even a middle school that had police in schools, right? And I think part of what this sort of era of mass incarceration has done is not just send a lot more people to prison, but make society as a whole a lot more punitive. So that cops in schools, first police got sent into schools that were these kind of, in working class communities of color. But then once that happened, it was, okay, well now we need to have cops in all schools, right? And time again, the more punitive solution, it gets implemented first among the people who are seen as the most disposable or the most marginal, but it actually comes to constitute society as a whole. So I went to a well-resourced public high school in suburban South Florida that had 2 police officers in it. And in my junior year, I think my senior year of high school, 2 kids were skipping school, and one of those police officers pulled a gun on them. And I think, fortunately, he didn't shoot, but that is the exact example, right, of why it's not just the school-to-prison pipeline that's a problem, but that the problem is even more severe than a pipeline, right? Because what this kind of excessive kind of and consistent turn to punishment has done has meant that things that used to be handled interpersonally are now handled through the criminal justice system, right? So in school, maybe it used to be the teacher, then it got you sent to the principal. But now the thing that used to get you sent to the principal is the thing that a police officer is here to deal with, right? And no matter how nice a police officer as an individual may be, how well-intentioned a police officer as an individual may be, the only thing that a police officer as a structural embodiment has at their disposal is handcuffs, tasers, a baton, and a gun. And so if you're sending someone with those tools to deal with things like someone skipping school, you wind up with 16-year-olds getting guns pulled on them, right? And so I think, right, what the sort of invasion of the criminal justice system into the school system has meant, right, is exactly this kind of, sort of creep of punishment in ways that both send people to prison, right, but also inculcate, right, a lot more sort of violence and a lot more fear that shouldn't be handled, right, things that shouldn't be handled by the criminal justice system. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could touch on the healthcare system in prisons and what freedoms and unfreedoms are seen there.
The healthcare system in prison? I think that's part of why I wanted to talk about the HIV and AIDS example, right? Because I think you have numerous problems of medical neglect in prison, right? Again, when you see people as disposable, their concerns are less important. That's my understatement of the evening. So there are all kinds of stories, right? Of someone has cancer and is given Tylenol in prison, right? I'm not saying that that's the only thing that happens, right? But you have lots of examples and stories of medical neglect, and now that could be individual healthcare professionals who care less than others, but as I have been sort of repeating perhaps, right? These are all structural problems, right? So you have people who are, 70, 80, 90 years old in prison, can't walk in a wheelchair, have, they're on, dialysis or they're on oxygen. That even if their medical needs are being met, prison is not conducive to a healthy environment, right? Because of that neglect, you have lots of routines for medical neglect. You have lots of issues of prisons incubating viruses, right? So, particularly in jails, where again the care is subpar relative to prison because people are moving in and out of jails a lot. Viruses can spread and bacteria can spread in jails, and then people are out, and so then all of a sudden you have a sort of blighted community that now is dealing with tuberculosis that someone caught while they were incarcerated. So I think you have lots of examples that where jails in particular become kind of vectors for disease precisely because of this, because prison is not a healthcare institution, right? And it's not set up to safeguard people's health, and so it doesn't do a very good job of it. Yeah.
A book we are reading in class has kind of discussed that slavery and just the racial caste system that we've seen throughout history has just continued to evolve. Whether we end slavery, it just transitions into segregation. We end segregation, and it transitions into mass incarceration. Do you see freedom as a method, as that solution to stop the evolution? And if so, do we do this by educating people on freedom as method? And how else?
Yeah. I mean, it can't be done by education alone, right? And I think why I keep coming back to these things as structural problems is because that means that there both needs to be, but also that there can be structural solutions, right? And I think that the argument, right, that Michelle Alexander makes about sort of racism being sort of perpetually just retooled in response to every victory, it's a little too pat. Right, it overlooks Reconstruction for one thing, right, and just sort of moves straight from slavery to Jim Crow. I'm very impressed that I did not hit the microphone there, and so I think that's a grave disservice, right, because Reconstruction is really the first moment in American history when there is an attempt to have genuine multiracial democracy, right? So Reconstruction is a very profound moment, and I think it's not a foregone conclusion that convict leasing and the kind of racist terrorism that undid Reconstruction. It's not a foregone conclusion that was going to happen or that needed to happen, and so I think, to my mind, thinking about freedom as method is a way to really reinsert the contingency into all of that, right? To reinsert the struggle back into all of that. And so I think it's not like we had one thing and then boop, now we have another, right? That's too simple. I think these things are sort of constantly being fought over, right? I also think that there's a way, I don't think she does this necessarily, but I think there's a way that just saying like one system was replaced by the other makes it seem like they're kind of the same system, right? And what I think is important to recognize is that even though it's what political scientists call layering, right? That things accumulate on top of the old system, but it's not the same system. Like the forms of control change, right? The ghetto is not the same as the plantation, right? And it's not the same as the prison. They share a lot in common, right? But they're not the same. And I think if we just see them as like one replaces the other, we can have a kind of fatalistic determination about it. Well, why even try? Right? But yes, so I think your sense of it is exactly right. But I think by talking about freedom as a method, what I want us to see is, yes, try, right? Like there's a lot to do. And I think there's a lot of changes that are happening, good changes that are happening and even now, right? And that are possible even now. And so I think things are a lot more in flux than one system becomes another. Yeah.
I kind of have a two-part question on institutional racism.
Okay.
And that is like, can institutions be racist? How? And would it make more sense to say that the laws and people within those institutions are racist and make it, like an easier, not necessarily easier, but like easier to tackle, I guess, because when you try to talk about institutions as a whole, it's a very difficult topic to tackle. It's just one.
Yeah, I think it's complicated, right? Because I think institutions absolutely can be and are racist, and individuals who serve those institutions and occupy those institutions are usually the ones who are advancing that racism, right? But I think there are some things that are inherently racist and can only, and which means that they can only produce racist results. That it doesn't matter who's there, right? So you see this a lot with prisons and with policing. Throughout the 60s and 70s, you had a number of uprisings, both in cities and in prisons, that where white police beat and in many cases killed, African Americans, or in some cases Puerto Ricans and Chicanos. And so the argument then became, okay, well, that's why we need to hire more people of color to be guards and officers. And as the last several years has hopefully reiterated, that's not the solution, right? So you can't simply change the race in this case, or the ethnicity of someone if the job itself is producing the result. And I think that, to me, like that gives me more hope in humans, right? Because it's not like, oh, there's just all these terrible people who are really invested in this bad thing. It's, oh, maybe we shouldn't have police in schools, right? Like maybe police don't actually belong in schools. That's I think, a very different answer, right? Than saying we should have black cops in black schools. Do you see that, right? We should have, an urban warden in this prison because most of the prisoners come from the city. Okay, but if the prison is still just putting people in cages and that's the end of the story, that warden can't do a lot, right? So the roles need to be changed, right? The institutions need to be changed. In some cases, right, the institutions need to be removed, right? And I think that's helpful to, rather than, even though it seems bigger, I think it's helpful than sort of putting the blame all on the individuals. Because I think we are often made by the institutions we inhabit. We become more studious when we are in college, right? When we go to class and we do our homework, like that makes us engage in these different kind of debates and do different things. Then when you graduate, if you have nothing to do with the university for the rest of your life, I'm sure you'll still enjoy reading some of the things that you like to read, but you'll think differently, right? You'll do different things. And so when the institution, when we inhabit institutions differently, and when we inhabit different institutions, we act differently. So it's not just the case that we make institutions also make us. Yeah. Actually, I'm sorry, you asked a question before, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned the structure, the institutions themselves being what's the issue, but when you go deeper, it kind of seems that the government itself is the issue. You can trace it back to court cases that, have instituted that, or even the war on drugs. And so when you see that the government, has gotten it wrong per se, what should their role be? Because it always seems that it comes from the individual movements of people trying to fix that mistake is where that freedom comes from. So what should the role of governments be when they're kind of the one perpetuating the whole cycle and giving it legitimacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government is a broad category that includes many different people and many different institutions, right? So I think I'm very heartened by some of the kind of reform district attorney candidates that have been elected in recent years, and to my mind, I think the most sort of progressive example is in Philadelphia, where a lifelong, or not lifelong, but longtime civil rights attorney sort of switched sides and went from being a defense attorney representing activists to then running for district attorney and winning. And he ran on a platform of trying to end mass incarceration, at least from his office in Philadelphia, which meant trying to end cash bail, which meant dramatic, like moving away from the kind of sentencing enhancements that district attorneys have done that has created such a crisis of mass incarceration. It means that he has everyone in the DA's office say when they are recommending a prison sentence to read into the record how much money it will cost to incarcerate someone for that time, right? So that people are sort of constantly aware of the human as well as the financial cost. Now, that in and of it, and he's going after drug companies rather than individual drug users when we're talking about a war on drugs. Because they're, to tackle the opioid crisis, he wants to go after the makers of opioids rather than after the people who are taking opioids, right? It seems like a much smarter way to address the issue. So that's from a district attorney's example, right? And I think there's lots of things that urban DAs can do, and I think there are other kind of reform DAs that are doing similar things. So in recent years, the kind of push for punishment has moved from urban DAs to rural DAs, right? So now, we have to have that fight in the rural counties, right? But I think the question of sort of what government can do, I think that depends or shifts depending on what branch of the government we're talking about, right? So I think district attorneys have a lot to do. I think within police, honestly, I think the issue is that police are just asked to do too many things, right? Again, my school and prison example, we could think about homelessness, right? That, the government's response to homelessness largely is to arrest people in encampments or to arrest them if they're having some kind of mental health crisis in public. None of those are good solutions. They're not good solutions for the person in crisis. They're not good solutions for society at large. But that's not a problem that police can solve, right? So instead of having police try to address that problem, we should have public housing, right? We should have other means of addressing the problem. And so I think in summary, right, I think there are some things that we need to ask institutions to do differently. I think some things actually belong to other institutions, and we have to actually fight to create or to expand those institutions or relative to the ones that are dealing with them now. Does that make sense?
Somebody have a question?
Yeah, I'm just going to call on you because you haven't asked yet.
We talk about prisoners being disposable.
Yes.
How prevalent is the use of prison work with hazardous work, such as fighting wildfires or with toxic chemicals, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so how prevalent are prisoners in doing toxic work? I don't know about the toxic chemical side of things in any great detail, but I mean, California is the obvious example where incarcerated people have been tasked as firefighters. And I think, again, I think there are some people who have done that work who have been glad to do that work, right? They feel like they are helping to save lives, they're helping to save their state. The issue is that work should count towards proof that they are making valuable contributions to society, so it should count towards getting them out of prison faster. And the barriers on employment for formerly incarcerated people need to be challenged and removed. And so I think what a number of people who have done that work have said, that I think I agree with wholeheartedly, is we're happy to do this, right? This is valuable work, and we can make a contribution. We want to do that. This should count towards release. This should, and we need to we should be paid for this work, right? We should be paid what firefighters are paid, and that should help pave the way for a career in the fire department, or a career in other industries. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road, right? I think you could say end prison labor and have a prison population of 2.3 million people all sitting around doing nothing, right? Or you could say let's have labor that is well compensated and unionized and meaningful inside and out of prison, and then I think we're actually going to see a lot of reductions in the prison system.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.